Welcome to the Global Connection, a Tel Aviv University podcast. Journey with us as we discover how TAU's academic community and friends are engaging with and helping to shape this ever-changing world. Hi, welcome to the Global Connection. I am your host for today, Dr. Anna Sajecki. I am very excited to have two wonderful individuals joining me today. Naomi Brenner is a professor from the Department of Near Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures at The Ohio State University. Her work focuses on modern Hebrew literature and culture with a specific focus on translingualism, or the way in which Jewish literary texts, whether in Hebrew, Yiddish, Arabic, or English, circulated and responded to each other across languages. And we also are joined by Tamar Sovran, a professor emerita from the Department of Hebrew Language and Semitic Languages at Tel Aviv University, where she was most recently the chair of the Chaim Rosenberg School of Jewish Studies. Her area of expertise is linguistics, with a focus on the study of meaning and meaning relations in language, and in particular, the language structures and processes unique to Hebrew and Hebrew poetry. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. From my understanding, you are both here at a conference with NAPH, which is the National Association of Professors of Hebrew. So you've been to a couple sessions. Are you enjoying it so far?
Definitely. You know, this is a really nice opportunity to bring together people who work on both Hebrew language and Hebrew literature from many different historical periods. And as someone who works in the United States, we don't always have this sort of opportunity all that often.
The conference takes place every year in another place, and this time we are blessed to have it in Israel. Although we missed the going abroad after 3 years, I think, of the virus and the pandemic, so we had the conference on Zoom, which was less intimate and less, I think, even less effective. But it's a very old conference, started from professors of Hebrew at the beginning to talk to each other about
Pedagogy.
Okay, and it kind of got volume when Hebrew literature entered, and Hebrew linguistics and rabbinics and Bible studies. So now it's became a very big conference.
Okay, wonderful. And I agree, such a nice thing to be back in person, right? After the years we went through with COVID and doing everything virtually. So I'm glad to hear the conference is going well so far. And as you mentioned, it's a unique opportunity to bring together scholars and experts in Hebrew, the language, as well as the literature from around the world together. And so even right here, we have Tamar, you're from Israel. And as you mentioned, Naomi, you're from the United States. And then in terms of fields, we're also bringing together linguistics with more literary theory. So maybe I'll ask you a little bit about that, because you do come from diverse fields in academia. So in your own words, can you tell me a little bit about the research that you do?
Sure. My background is in comparative literature. That's where my training was for my doctorate. And while I teach more broadly than that, because I teach at a large public university in the United States, but my interests for my research are very much on Jewish multilingualism and what the fact that historically Jews spoke many different languages, often individuals spoke many different languages, how that impacted both literary production, so what languages they wrote in, how they wrote, how they moved in between languages, but also literary circulation, how text moved around with their writers. If you look throughout much of the 20th century, which is the period that I focus on, you see radical movement, migration of Jews from place to place. And so how that is registered, both in terms of literary language, but also literary texts.
Okay, thank you. And Tamar?
I'm basically a philosopher. I started as a philosopher of language, but already with a very deep interest in Hebrew. So I slowly turned into focus on Hebrew text and the amazing development of the Hebrew, the revival of Hebrew, which we kind of say not revived, but came back, because it never died. There were texts all the time. during even the 500 years. But the amazing phenomenon of coming into a native language and a poetic language and a scientific language, it's an amazing phenomenon. So there's a lot to do research on. And I feel myself as a teacher. I've mentored like over 30 master and doctoral students with various subjects, and I'm still doing it after retirement. And I give one course. I'm volunteering in my own department. I give one course with a very difficult name. It is called in Hebrew, Safa v'Shira, Mabat מהבלשנות הקוגניטיבית, which means language and poetry, a view from cognitive linguistics, which is kind of holding 4 stones in your hands and trying to combine them. But it's very interesting and very rewarding too. I feel young when I have this very capable young people next to me and doing research.
It's one of my favorite things about working with a university is the students, right? And their brilliance and their enthusiasm
curious, very, and open to new ideas. So it's really enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm. So I am quite new here. I am learning Hebrew. I'm very much at the beginning, but for me, what I know of the language is it's one of the most interesting languages in the world. So especially when you consider that history of its years as primarily a sacred language, and then the late 18th century becoming more and more of a literary language. And then today it's something I use when I order coffee or, pick up my groceries or go to the bank.
And you do it naturally because it's a mother tongue.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So for both of you, again, you're coming from different traditions, but could you talk a little bit based on your research of what the uniqueness of the Hebrew language really means to you?
Why don't you start with that
I'll
one?
start. Whenever you take even one word, it is full of associations, connotations. Take for example the word makom, just place or area, but it goes back to the holy, right? And whenever you do it, I'll talk about my own lecture yesterday. It was a session for linguists looking at literary text. So my student talked about 2 Hebrew poets, Yona Volach, which is very known, and we had one talking about her in the literary section, and Leah Ayalon, which is, she doesn't want to have her pictures, nobody knows her, although she had like over 10 poetry books and very good critics, but both of them are very unique in breaking syntax, which makes their poetry very, very obscure. So we are looking for other ways of reading it, like reading non-linearly. My dissertation title was Semantic Fields. So now I'm using it as a system to decipher or interpret very difficult poetry with while you're looking at the lines that connect words in fields, and then the connection and the relationship between the fields. All of a sudden, there is interpretation. So this is what my student talked about. I myself took a very, the name of my subject was Dchisut, which means condensed Hebrew construct, especially the Paul constructs, which are very, very poetic, like Leah Goldberg says, Rechovot halumei ahava, streets that are stricken by love. When you would just make it very simple in English, but in Hebrew it's very, very condensed. So this is just one example, but it goes back to the 6th century when Yanai, the poet in Israel, said about us that we are glumei gush. If you ask an average Israeli what is glumei gush, they'll never know what it means, because it goes back to a midrash. This is a good example for you for the layers. Glumei gush, it means that God took us and made a golem a person from a gush, from a piece of dirt or earth. So it became, we are glumei gush, in a passive voice. So this is, again, I think it's a good example of how Hebrew is multi-layered and very poetic in its own nature. And it's amazed me that every generation we have new poets with new rule-breaking methods and creativity.
Okay, thank you, Tamar. Naomi.
I think for me, there's so many different ways to answer your question, but let me give one, which is I'm really interested in intersections between history and culture, specifically history, the history of Hebrew and Hebrew culture, and literary texts. And so for me, it's really fascinating to look to one historical moment or one historical period, which you could take, for example, the 19th century, where you do have writers and readers of Hebrew. But virtually no one speaks Hebrew. It's not a spoken language. And what amazes me is within the span of just a couple decades, if we want to take, the late 19th century, so the 1880s, the 1890s, and by the early decades of the 20th century, by the 1930s, let's say the 1940s, you have a language in which people are still writing, are still reading, that's constant, but are also speaking. And it's fascinating to see how that transformation is worked out in terms of literary texts. One of a corpus of texts that I spoke about, one text in particular earlier today, is trashy fiction, what's also called popular literature or non-canonical literature. And there we can really see this transition between, in the 19th century, there's very little of this kind of popular fiction in Hebrew because people don't read in Hebrew. They'll read in Yiddish, they'll read this sort of stuff in Ladino, in Judeo-Arabic, in Russian, in German.
Holy and sublime.
Exactly. And so it's really fascinating to trace this transformation historically to a point in the 1930s in which, of course, Hebrew is going to have its own, entertainment fiction or trashy fiction and things like that. So lots more there, but we can see lots of unique elements of Hebrew's story throughout time.
Okay.
What's interesting is the way that you had to create the personas in the prose. They have to speak, and there is no spoken. So Mendele was one of the big influence on imitating Yiddish idioms and way of expressions into Hebrew, but purifying it, making it very, very Hebrew. I want to give you an example. When you want to say that you touch something very delicately and you use the gloves, do you know the expression?
I think so.
You want to treat something very delicately, you say it, לטפל בזה
כפפות?
כן, כפפות של משי. But in Yiddish it's mit zaydene, hand whatever. But in Hebrew it says בכפפות של משי. The bet is Hebrew. While he translated, but he kind of make it very pure Hebrew. So he is one of the sources that when we speak and say, אל תקשקש לי, or נעשה לי חושך בעיניים, it's gewesen mir finster in the Eugen. It came back from Yiddish, from spoken Yiddish, because Yiddish was spoken for a very long time, in the 9th century. So Yiddish was alive and Hebrew was not. And it's Bialik who called them like the kind of sisters that held each other during the times when one flourished and the other was a servant, and then they changed roles. So it's the whole process is very interesting.
I love that image of two languages as sisters.
This is a delicate way to put it, because there is one researcher who called it I think it's Bialik, came from Bialik, the lady and the servant. And they kind of changed places. One was the lady and the other served it. And because there are many Hebrew words in Yiddish, right? And Aramaic words from Hebrew, through the Talmud came to the Yiddish, and then it came back to Hebrew.
There's a rich literature and a really fascinating one on the relationship between Hebrew and Yiddish. And look, you can also look at Hebrew and Arabic. You can look at other languages as well. But there was a period in time in which there was great competition between the languages too. So
And a war,
they
even a war.
are rendered as sisters, sometimes as man and woman, and so we've got a very strongly gendered element there too. Hebrew as the masculine language, the
Sfat ha'av, right,
the language
father.
of the Bet Midrash, the study house, the language of the tradition, and thus the one who demanded respect, and then Yiddish is the Weiber language, so the womanly language, the one of the
Were not
home.
scholarly, not educated. I mean, they are not allowed to. Some of them knew only Yiddish.
Okay.
Of the women knew only Yiddish or the other spoken language, but not. They were not allowed to study Gemara or Talmud.
Okay.
So, but on the other hand, I mean, okay, that's okay. You go on.
Well, one thing I'll say, taking us back to the conference a bit, and I hope I'm not getting too far ahead of ourselves here, is something that struck me in looking at the program and some of the sessions that I've been to already, is how prominent women writers are on this year's program. And I think that's a really important thing, and it represents some trends within the field more broadly. But we were both at a panel that focused on women poets earlier today, and I know there are a lot of other sessions that are looking both at men and women who have written in Hebrew and how they've done so. And I think that's really important in terms of broadening the canon and looking more widely and more creatively at many different people who, over the years, over the centuries, have been writing in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
With your permission, I would like to speak about a general phenomenon of kind of the deteriorating of your humanities. And here in the university, we can see that the departments in the bachelor degree, we are getting less and less students, but it's flourishing in the graduate school and doctorals. So I don't know if we have to. People keep moaning about this this phenomenon of not having enough students in the lower degrees, but we have very good researchers in the higher degrees. We had like 200. In all humanities, over 400 doctoral students. So this is kind of hope for us.
It's very hopeful, and like you mentioned, it's interesting too to see that change from the bachelor to the graduate level. But I wonder, if we connect the graduate work of the humanities with the meaning behind studying languages, what languages can do, what they can tell us about the societies we live in, the way we evolve as individuals. These are always such foundational questions, regardless of what era we're in. It's about the way that we live and interact. And
I would like to tell you about a project that our present chair of the department initiated, to have high school students coming and take courses and getting points for it, and sometimes even change it from the bagrut for the matriculation. So this is also a way to recruit new students to an area which was in a way neglected in high school.
Do you think we should be doing more with younger generations in terms of teaching languages?
So I'll reflect from the perspective of someone who's teaching in the United States, where there is less and less emphasis on teaching foreign languages. And that, that's a very broad statement and is true in some places and not in others across the United States. But across higher education, we have seen both many institutions decreasing language requirements, so no longer requiring students to study a foreign language or no longer requiring as much foreign language study. And we've also seen cuts to the departments that teach these languages. So even for students who might want to seek out these languages because they want to, more and more, I teach at a large state university, and we're fortunate to have a vibrant language program in Hebrew and many other languages. My department alone teaches more than 10 different languages, ancient and modern. But more and more, we're sharing courses online. We're getting requests from other universities, especially smaller universities, who no longer hire people, no longer have the budget to hire people to teach language. And that's a scary thing, because in the United States, where so many people are not really aware of the world around them and oblivious to many things about kind of what it means to be a global citizen or part of a broader world, studying foreign languages is such, or just a single foreign language is such an important way, not only to learn language, but to have a glimpse into that culture, into that world, and the world more generally.
And being more sensitive to nuances, to differences between people, between sources, between cultures. And we're kind of losing it when we don't emphasize. I had to study 3 different languages apart from Hebrew in order to get my doctorate, but it doesn't exist anymore.
So, when we started the conversation and some of what you've said about Hebrew language and literature, my impression is about the vibrancy of the language, especially in terms of how it has evolved and continues to evolve. And so, I see you both as researchers who view languages as very much living, that whether it be new poets who find out new ways to work with language, whether it be about new cultural intersections that move literary conversations forward. So for you, could you talk a little bit more about some of the, maybe Tamar, some of the biggest patterns you found in terms of the evolution of Hebrew as a language, or the way that it has continued?
The most interesting thing is the way it became a native tongue. I want to tell the story about Ben Yehuda, who insisted on having his firstborn son, Itamar, not to hear any other language but Hebrew for the first few years. And it's an amazing thing. People say that you are utilizing him. He will not be able to speak at all if you speak to him only with a dead language. And then there's a story, very interesting story, that he was suffering. Ben Yehuda was suffering from objection by especially the more Orthodox, who were against reviving the holy language, and they didn't have enough food even at home. And once he came back and he saw his wife lulling singing a Russian lullaby to the child who was 3 and never spoke before, and he pushed her, and he said, "You are murdering my son." And the boy opened his mouth and said, "Forbidden mommy beat, forbidden mom, daddy beat mommy," in Hebrew. Asur Abba marbit ima was the first Hebrew sentence. And this man became a journalist. He knew many languages, and he was a very, very broadly educated journalist, Itamar ben Avi. And so this is a very typical example of an insistence of one person. But we must insist that the whole process could not be held by one person. There were teachers who insisted on teaching Hebrew by going to in my hometown. I was born in Rishon, and there was the first Hebrew-speaking elementary school. And the kids came from families who never spoke Hebrew, but they brought Hebrew to the home. And we should just say that your mother studied her mother tongue from her son. So they went to the fields and they said, "This is a butterfly, you should call it parpar, and this is a flower, you should call it perach." And they made books and poems, and this is how it started. At the end of the 19th century, 1885 was the first elementary school in Hebrew. So there were also in the Moshavot, in the settlements in the Galilee and everywhere, there were a group of enthusiasts who insisted on teaching Hebrew in Hebrew.
Okay.
And later on, as a teacher in the United States, I taught Hebrew in Hebrew.
Okay.
which is a very good system to teach, right? I think you do it too, right? Remember them choking with "Ruti lechikchi lechem," which is very difficult for English speakers, but it's a very, I think it's a very good way to study a language, just to be exposed to it. And there is a lot on the shoulders of parents to read to the kids and to make them. I myself read even the Greek mythology to my 12-year-old son when the other small ones were listening, because this is where you get the appreciation of culture, of language, of its richness.
So
But a lot is on the shoulders of parents.
on the shoulders of parents and families and sort of those individual connections for ensuring the
But it's
the
a vicious
continuance.
circle. If you don't have educated parents, you will not get educated
Right.
kids.
Right, right. And Naomi, I know you work more with literary texts again, but I've read a little bit of your work on bilingualism and the cultural conversations and literary conversations between Yiddish and Hebrew specifically, and you trace different movements of how those interconnections and points of connection result in shifts in literary traditions in Hebrew. So can you talk a bit more about some of the most interesting or exciting points of shifting literary traditions that you've come across?
Sure. In fairly broad terms, these days we still tend to study, we tend to kind of isolate literatures by language. So I'll take my university as an example. You can study English literature. You can study German literature, Russian, Japanese, Hebrew, but all of these are almost like they're silos. You approach them, you learn the language if necessary, you learn a particular literary tradition, but that somehow imagines or pretends that literatures exist in these self-contained bubbles. And something that I think a more dynamic reading of texts and reading of the sort of history of literature shows us is that people are constantly, yes, they are. You take a well-known writer of Hebrew literature, chances are that they are well-read in Hebrew texts that preceded them and, know Bialik and know, many of the classics. But I think what a comparative approach to reading literature gives us is the ability to read across boundaries and oftentimes to find that those boundaries between literature, so in my work that's often between Hebrew and Yiddish, are so much fuzzier, or they're so much more porous than you might think. So yes, if we look at the early 20th century, we have writers who are come to be known as Hebrew writers, Agnon being a very famous one. And you have writers who come to be known as Yiddish writers. But that tends to obscure or encourage us to forget, when we only study those writers in the context of a single literary tradition, how much contact there was between writers who almost all of them spoke more than one language and read in more than one language, but also experimented themselves as writers in a variety of different languages too.
So again, you're at the conference, and there are people from all over the world who are there as well. So can you talk about the global community of scholars right now that you find yourselves in? Is it a close-knit community? Do you really work together on things? Is it every time there's a conference you go and you meet some new people?
You just said it. I mentioned in the session that Laura, who gave the talk, I heard her last year and went to buy the 2 books by the poetess she was speaking about. So there is a connection, and we become friends. And but the COVID kind of cut some of it. Now we are working on connecting it back.
I don't know much about the history of this organization, which is titled National Association of Professors of Hebrew.
It's because it started in America.
Right. So I assume that National was imagining a kind of American focus to it. And what I think is brilliant about this conference is that I mean, the national is still hanging out there in the title, but it doesn't actually translate to reality, which is to say, I was part of a panel that had one person from who teaches Hebrew in Warsaw, University of Warsaw. Myself and one other person were at American universities, another person at Israeli University. And I think that is really the gift of a conference like this. Like Tamar said earlier, something that I appreciate more after several years on Zoom than I did before. I think I took it for granted earlier. But it's that opportunity to bring together people who likely, paths wouldn't cross, whether it's geographically or sometimes kind of scholarly, not just because people work on Hebrew in some fashion doesn't necessarily mean that our work will coincide in any meaningful way. And one of the best things at conferences like this, and I would categorize this as a fairly small and intimate conference in the scheme of things, is that you have the opportunity, whether it's in sessions or just when you bump into someone in the hall and you introduce themselves, to connect, to learn more about what they're doing. Maybe it's something you come back to or you'll see each other again in the future, maybe not. But that, to me, those are really valuable interactions.
And it is very well organized.
Yes.
The organizers they're working on it. It's a huge undertaking to organize such a conference and to be in touch with everybody. And there is there is a president who is kind of giving the whole framework, but there is a person who is who really works on the relations between, and this is Jared, who is very good at keeping everything to work and everything to be very exact and to communicate with. There was a problem with my fee or whatever, he's there. So in a way, it's intimate. And I think you're right. It's less than, but there are huge conferences when you get lost, and this is not one of them.
That is true. And I think here, as a participant, I'll grab the opportunity just to thank, this partnership between NAPH and Tel Aviv University, because I think, we're on day 2 of 3, but this is a very well organized and thoughtful conference. And
in a way, I miss going abroad, but it's okay. I was I think at 18. 4 years ago it was in Amsterdam, and then it was in Boston. Mm-hmm. So, way back we were in UCLA. So it's an opportunity to see the world too.
Okay. Well, Tamar and Naomi, I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time out of the conference to come chat with me about Hebrew language and literature for a little bit. And I hope you enjoy the next panel that you go to and the rest of the conference.
I became friends with Naomi. I didn't know her before. Thanks to you, and thanks for the good questions.
Wonderful.
Yes. Thank you both.
Goodbye.
Thank you.